It is 8 o'clock on a Thursday night in Brisbane, Australia, November 26, 1942. On the corner of Creek and Adelaide Streets, a crowd has formed. Not dozens, hundreds, maybe more, Australian soldiers, American soldiers, civilians pressed against shop fronts, trying to understand what they were watching. What they are watching is a siege. The ground floor of the American Post Exchange, the U.S. military's private canteen, their own piece of America transplanted into the Queensland heat, is being torn apart from the outside by men using whatever they can find. Bricks, bottles, iron rails ripped from nearby fences. Inside, American military police have barricaded the doors. Outside, the crowd keeps pushing forward. Then a military policeman appears at the entrance, holding a shotgun. The noise fades. The shouting stops. An Australian soldier steps forward through the crowd. His name is Edward Webster, 24 years old, a gunner with the 2nd Anti-Tank Regiment, a man who had already survived war overseas. He moves closer. There is a struggle. A single shot rings out. Webster collapses. He is dead before he reaches the pavement. For 3 seconds, nobody moves. Then Brisbane explodes. What follows becomes 2 nights of violence between soldiers of allied nations fighting the same war against the same enemy. By the time it ends, hundreds will be injured. 1 man will be permanently dead, and authorities on both sides will move quickly to control how much of the story the world ever hears. But to understand why it happened, why Brisbane was already standing on the edge, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the day the Americans arrived, back to the moment welcome slowly turned into resentment, back to the misunderstandings that made conflict inevitable, back to the 3 words that captured everything. Look at those peasants. How does an alliance strong enough to fight a world war nearly collapse in a single night? The answer begins months earlier, when Brisbane stopped being just a city and became the center of the Pacific War. Early 1942 was one of the most frightening periods Australia had ever experienced. Japan's rapid expansion across Southeast Asia shattered assumptions about distance and safety. Singapore had fallen. Darwin had been bombed. For the first time, Australians believed invasion might be possible. Brisbane suddenly mattered. The quiet river city transformed into a massive military hub almost overnight. Convoys filled its roads. Warehouses overflowed with supplies. Office buildings became command centers coordinating operations across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Then came one of the most significant arrivals of the war. General Douglas MacArthur, evacuated from the Philippines, established his Southwest Pacific headquarters in Brisbane. With him came planners, intelligence officers, communications units, and the machinery of modern war. And then came the Americans. They arrived by ship, by aircraft, by convoy. Young men stepping into Queensland heat, wearing clean uniforms and carrying equipment that looked impossibly modern to local eyes. For civilians, the Americans were exciting. They spoke differently, moved differently, laughed loudly. Their confidence felt contagious. And they brought abundance, chocolate bars, chewing gum, cigarettes, nylon stockings that became prized gifts in a country living under rationing. At first, Brisbane welcomed them warmly. They were allies, reinforcements, proof that Australia would not stand alone against Japan. But beneath the celebration, comparison began quietly shaping opinion. And comparison is dangerous during wartime. Because while many Americans were arriving fresh into the conflict, Australian soldiers had already been fighting for years. And they noticed the difference immediately. Australian servicemen returning home were not inexperienced recruits. Many had fought brutal campaigns in North Africa against German forces under Erwin Rommel. They had endured desert heat, long marches, and relentless combat. They were veterans. They were tired. And when they walked through Brisbane, they saw American troops earning higher pay, eating better food, and shopping at exclusive American PX stores filled with goods Australians could barely obtain. The contrast felt unfair. To Australians, it appeared the Americans had arrived late to a war others had already suffered through, yet seemed to be living better. To Americans, Australians sometimes appeared informal, relaxed, even undisciplined. Neither perception was fully accurate. But perception rarely needs accuracy to create resentment. The difference ran deeper than supplies. American military culture emphasized strict hierarchy and visible discipline. Orders were expected to be followed immediately. Australian military culture valued mateship and equality. Authority existed, but it was often expressed with less formality. American military. Police enforced rules aggressively among U.S. troops. Australians, however, were not accustomed to being ordered around by foreign MPS in their own city. Small confrontations became common. Arguments outside bars, shoving matches near dance halls. Nothing serious, not yet. But tension accumulated like pressure inside a sealed container. And in Brisbane, pressure was everywhere. Young soldiers far from home, fear of invasion, alcohol, boredom between deployments, all waiting for one moment to ignite it. Nightlife intensified the problem. Dance halls filled every evening. American soldiers with more disposable income could afford drinks and gifts. Their novelty attracted attention, especially from civilians eager for distraction from wartime anxiety. Australian soldiers noticed. Jealousy mixed with pride. Arguments grew sharper. Meanwhile, American MPS continued enforcing discipline exactly as they had been trained to do. Each confrontation reinforced a growing belief among Australians that Americans behaved arrogantly. Each confrontation reinforced American belief that Australians resisted authority unnecessarily. Two groups fighting the same war were slowly learning to dislike each other. By late November 1942, Brisbane looked calm, but beneath the surface, the city was waiting for a spark. And the spark would come from something incredibly small, a single leave pass. On the evening of November 26th, an American soldier named Private James Stein had been drinking with Australian friends near the American Post Exchange building at the corner of Adelaide and Creek Streets. Military police approached and demanded to see his leave pass. Routine procedure. Stein was slow to produce it. The MP grew impatient and moved to arrest him. To the MP, this was discipline. To the Australians watching, it looked like bullying. They intervened. Voices rose. Crowds gathered within seconds. The MP raised his baton to control the situation. That single motion changed everything. Australians surged forward to defend what they saw as a mate being mistreated. The scuffle spread instantly. More military police arrived, more soldiers joined, and within minutes, a small argument transformed into a riot. What happened next shocked even the men involved, because the crowd didn't disperse. It grew, and soon thousands of Allied soldiers were fighting in the streets of Brisbane. Word moved faster than any official order ever could. Soldiers leaving nearby hotels heard shouting and moved toward it. Civilians followed out of curiosity. Passing servicemen stopped, watched, and then chose sides without fully understanding why. Within minutes, what had begun as a scuffle between a few men transformed into something far larger. A mass of bodies pressed toward the American Post Exchange building. The Post Exchange was more than just a store. To American troops, it was normal. A place to buy supplies, cigarettes, and comforts from home. To many Australians, it had become a symbol. Inside were goods they struggled to obtain under rationing. Inside was proof that American soldiers lived differently, sometimes better, despite arriving later in the war. And symbols attract anger. Riots rarely begin with ideology. They begin when emotion finds a target. That night, the Post Exchange became that target. American military police attempted to push the crowd back using batons and shouted commands. But the situation had already passed the point where authority alone could restore order. Australians shouted insults. Americans shouted back. Punches landed. Someone threw a bottle. Then another. Glass shattered against the building walls. The crowd surged forward again. Inside the post exchange, American personnel scrambled to secure entrances while MPs formed defensive lines outside. Every push from the military police hardened the resistance. Every shove confirmed the crowd's belief that force was being used unfairly. The fight spread outward into nearby streets. Groups broke off into smaller clashes, fists swinging under dim lighting designed to hide the city from enemy aircraft. Brisbane had not seen enemy troops, yet it now looked like a battlefield anyway. And then the situation changed in a way no one present could undo, because someone introduced a weapon into a fight that had until then been mostly fists. As pressure mounted around the PX entrance, American servicemen inside armed themselves to prevent the building from being overrun. Among them was Private Norbert Grant, carrying a shotgun. The weapon was meant as a deterrent, a visible warning. But crowds do not interpret weapons calmly. Australians surged forward again, some attempting to grab the weapon during the chaos. Hands pulled, bodies collided. Shouting drowned out commands. And then the shotgun fired. The blast echoed through the street louder than anything that had come before. For a brief second, everything stopped. Gunner Edward Webster fell to the ground. The riot changed instantly. Before that moment, it had been anger. Now, it was death. Witnesses later described a strange pause. Shock replacing adrenaline. Men staring, trying to understand what had just happened. Because no one had come to the street expecting a killing. This was supposed to be a fight, not a funeral. Medics rushed forward, but Webster's wounds were fatal. News spread through the crowd almost immediately, and grief mixed with rage in dangerous proportions. At that moment, Brisbane stood on the edge of something far worse. If the violence continued, it could spiral into open armed conflict between Allied forces. Commanders understood that immediately, and they knew they had minutes, not hours, to regain control. Senior officers began arriving rapidly. Australian officers shouted orders to their own men, demanding withdrawal. American commanders pulled MPS into tighter defensive formations to avoid further escalation. Gradually, exhaustion slowed the violence. The crowd began to thin. Some soldiers drifted away in silence. Others argued loudly as they left, still angry, but aware that something irreversible had occurred. By around 10 o'clock that night, the streets finally quieted. But calm didn't mean resolution. It meant a pause, because Webster's death ensured the story was not finished. The first night had ended, but Brisbane woke the next morning more dangerous than before, because now the riot had a martyr. Sunlight revealed the damage clearly. Broken windows lined the streets. Debris is scattered across pavements. Medical stations treated injured soldiers from both sides. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Some claimed Americans had fired deliberately into crowds. Others insisted Australians had attempted to storm American positions. Truth became blurred by emotion, and emotion travels faster than facts. Inside headquarters, officers from both nations faced an uncomfortable realization. The riot had not been random. It had been inevitable. Months of tension had finally surfaced, and unless something changed quickly, it could happen again. By evening on November 27th, that fear proved justified, because the crowd came back. Brisbane felt tense in a way that could not be measured. Nothing official had changed. Shops opened. Military vehicles moved as usual. Officers issued routine orders. But beneath normal activity ran something heavier. Anger had not disappeared overnight. It had spread. Across barracks, mess halls, and training grounds, soldiers talked about Webster's death. Each retelling sharpened emotion. Details shifted. Responsibility hardened, depending on who was speaking. To many Australians, the story was simple. An Australian soldier had died at American hands in his own city, and that feeling refused to fade. Riots often end when exhaustion wins, but sometimes grief resets the clock, and Brisbane was about to learn the difference. As darkness fell, groups of Australian servicemen began moving toward the city centre again, not marching, not organized, but drawn by shared outrage and unfinished emotion. By early evening, hundreds had gathered near the American Red Cross building and surrounding streets. American military police were already waiting. This time, they were prepared. Armed patrols stood guard near American facilities. Shotguns and sidearms were visible, intended as a deterrence. But deterrence depends on perception. To the arriving Australians, the weapons looked less like protection and more like a challenge. Shouting began almost immediately. Arguments reignited. The fragile calm of the morning vanished within minutes. Unlike the first night, this confrontation carried memory. Both sides expected trouble. That expectation alone made restraint harder. Small fights broke out across intersections. Soldiers pushed through crowds, searching for opponents from the night before. Bottles flew again. Batons swung again. And soon the mass of shouting servicemen began moving through the streets as one shifting body of anger. The noise echoed through buildings darkened by blackout regulations. Residents watched from windows, unsure whether they were witnessing a riot or the beginning of something far worse. Because where the crowd moved next terrified Allied commanders more than the violence itself. As momentum carried the crowd forward, it drifted. Dangerously close to the AMP building, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. Inside that building, strategies directing the Pacific War were being planned. Outside, Allied soldiers shouted insults and fought beneath its windows. The symbolism was alarming. If discipline could collapse here, in the command center of Allied operations, what message did that send? Officers feared photographs, rumors, or exaggerated reports reaching enemy propaganda networks. Japan would not need to invent division. It would simply report it. Commanders realized the situation had crossed from social unrest into strategic embarrassment. And embarrassment during wartime could be dangerous. Australian officers pushed aggressively into the crowd, ordering their men back toward barracks. American commanders restrained MPs from aggressive pursuit, understanding that further violence risked another fatal incident. The goal changed from control to de-escalation. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to break apart, not because anger disappeared, because exhaustion returned. Fights dwindled, voices faded. And sometime late that night, Brisbane finally fell quiet again. The riot was over, but the real problem had only begun. Because now Allied leadership had to confront a question no war plan had prepared them for. How do you repair trust between allies who just fought each other? Meetings began almost immediately. Reports arrived describing injuries, property damage, and the death of Webster. Commanders compared accounts from both sides, discovering how differently each group interpreted the same events. American officers emphasized the need for discipline and protection of military facilities. Australian officers emphasized resentment created by unequal conditions and aggressive policing. Both perspectives were partially true, and neither solved the problem alone. The conclusion reached quietly behind closed doors was uncomfortable. No single person had caused the riot. The system itself had allowed tensions to grow unchecked. Leaders worried most about repetition. If another confrontation occurred, casualties could rise dramatically. Armed troops facing each other in crowded streets could easily escalate beyond control. So, immediate changes were ordered. Certain units were moved away from Brisbane. MP strength was increased, but instructed to avoid unnecessary confrontation. American facilities adjusted security procedures. None of these actions appeared dramatic publicly, but privately they reflected urgency. The alliance had been shaken, and rebuilding confidence became a priority equal to logistics or strategy. Yet even as commanders worked to stabilize relations, another decision was being made quietly. The story itself would not be allowed to grow. Wartime censorship already controlled information flow across Australia. Now it became a tool for containment. Reports were limited, details minimized, headlines avoided sensational language. The goal was not deception as much as protection. Morale mattered. Families at home needed to believe Allied unity remained strong. So the Battle of Brisbane began fading from public attention almost as quickly as it had erupted. But silence does not erase memory, especially for the men who were there. Because while newspapers moved on, soldiers carried the experience with them. And what happened next would slowly transform resentment into something unexpected. Respect. It did not return overnight. It did not arrive through speeches, orders, or carefully written reports. It returned slowly, carried north by ships and aircraft as soldiers left Brisbane and moved back toward real battlefields. Because the distance from the city changed perspective, and combat changes everything. In Brisbane, Americans and Australians had argued over pride, authority, and fairness. In New Guinea and the islands beyond, those arguments stopped mattering, because survival has a way of simplifying relationships. By early 1943, Allied operations intensified across the Southwest Pacific. Jungle warfare replaced city streets. Humidity replaced nightlife. And enemies were no longer allies standing a few meters away, but hidden fighters waiting in dense terrain. American and Australian units increasingly operated in overlapping campaigns. Supply lines crossed, airfields were shared, patrol routes intersected. And slowly, soldiers who had once fought each other in Brisbane began relying on each other under fire. Stories circulated among troops. Americans are learning from the Australian experience in jungle movement. Australians are benefiting from American logistics and firepower. The strengths of each force became clearer away from the social tensions of city life. Where Brisbane had highlighted differences, combat revealed complementarity. An American soldier who might have seen Australians as informal now saw calm veterans who moved confidently through harsh terrain. An Australian soldier who once viewed Americans as arrogant began seeing determination and industrial strength that kept operations supplied and moving. Respect rarely grows from agreement. It grows from shared hardship, and shared hardship was everywhere at the front. But even as cooperation improved, commanders understood something important. The riot had exposed a weakness that alliances throughout history often ignore. Cultural misunderstanding can be as dangerous as enemy fire. No official doctrine announced, "Learn from Brisbane." Yet subtle changes appeared. Joint briefings emphasized cooperation between national forces. Officers became more aware of cultural differences during combined operations. Command structures encouraged communication instead of assumptions. The lesson was simple but powerful. Allies cannot operate effectively if one side feels disrespected. And respect requires understanding how authority appears through another culture's eyes. These adjustments were small, but small changes often prevent large disasters. Meanwhile, investigations into the riot continued. Witness statements were reviewed. Responsibility is examined carefully. The American serviceman whose shotgun discharged faced court-martial proceedings, but was ultimately acquitted under claims of self-defense. Several Australians involved in assaults received convictions and sentences. The legal outcomes satisfied few completely. But punishment was never the primary objective. Stability was. The war demanded forward movement, not prolonged blame. And as months passed, something unexpected happened. The Battle of Brisbane began disappearing. Major offensives dominated headlines. Guadalcanal, New Guinea. Island campaigns are pushing steadily toward Japan. Compared to those battles, a riot between allies seems small. Wartime censorship limited detailed reporting. Public attention shifted naturally toward victories and losses overseas. Within a year, many civilians barely remembered the event. Not erased, just overshadowed. History often forgets uncomfortable moments when larger stories demand attention. Yet among veterans, Brisbane remained a story told quietly, sometimes with humor, sometimes with embarrassment, always with recognition that it had come dangerously close to something worse. Because the riot forced both nations to confront an uncomfortable truth, unity in war is not automatic. It must be maintained constantly. Wars are often described through maps and strategies. But alliances exist at a human level. They depend on individuals sharing space, resources, and stress. In Brisbane, young men far from home lived under the fear of invasion, long periods of waiting, and constant uncertainty. Add unequal conditions and cultural misunderstanding, and tension becomes inevitable. The riot revealed not weakness of character, but pressure without release. And once leaders recognized that, they began managing alliances differently, not only through command structures, but through awareness. By the time the war ended, Americans and Australians would remember fighting side by side far more than fighting each other. Yet the Battle of Brisbane left behind a lesson that extended far beyond World War II, a lesson about pride, perception, and the fragile line between ally and adversary. When World War II finally ended, Brisbane returned to being an ordinary city. The convoys disappeared, headquarters emptied, foreign uniforms faded from its streets. Buildings that once directed massive military operations returned to civilian use. Shops reopened fully. Music returned without blackout restrictions. Life moved forward the way it always does after war, quietly replacing urgency with routine. But memory does not leave as quickly as armies. Veterans carried Brisbane with them long after the conflict ended, not as a story of hatred, but as a story of how close things came to breaking. Because what made the Battle of Brisbane remarkable was not its scale. It was how ordinary the beginning had been. No grand strategy failed that night. No enemy agent sabotaged relations. There was no conspiracy. Just a tired soldier slow to show a leave pass. An impatient MP doing his job. A crowd already carrying months of frustration. History often turns on moments that feel insignificant at the time,